class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 19 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Seattle Kraken, in which the Sharks have lost 7-1. And as of late, the Sharks have been a bit better. Their losses more competitive. They've managed to even pull off a couple of wins, including a pretty strong performance and outing against the St. Louis Blues just a few days ago, where they won 5-1. But it's important to remember that those couple of massive losses that the Sharks took against the Canucks and the Pittsburgh Penguins were combined. They gave up 20 goals against in those two games. Really were not all that long ago. In fact, both of those games occurred in the very same month that we are still in the early parts of November. And so it is not that far in the past that the Sharks were getting absolutely destroyed. And so to see it happen once again here is disappointing, but not all that surprising either with this 7-1 loss. This is now the fifth time in just the 19 games that the Sharks have played in which they have lost by a deficit of 5 or more goals. That means 1 in every 4 games that the Sharks play, they get crushed. Pretty much once a week at this point, you should expect the Sharks to just get destroyed by one of the 31 NHL teams on the schedule for them. Which means, on top of that, for the fourth time this season, there really bears no value to discuss how the players tonight actually performed from a San Jose Sharks perspective. The vast majority of them were quite bad. A couple of them maybe were half decent, but none of them were in any way all that good. And so it really, there's no point here. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have nothing to talk about from tonight's game. Now, they're not exactly going to be specifically targeted at this game, though a couple of the points will be, but maybe more so in the general sense. And to start off, I want to talk about a player who, of course, a lot of people have come to love thus far this season, and that is William Eklund. And this goes back to what happened at the end of the other night's game against the Vancouver Canucks, a Sharks 3-1 loss to that team. And it was that Eklund got bumped down from the first line to the second line. Now, I wasn't familiar with the reasoning for why that was back when I made the review of that game, and so in my logical opinion was that Eklund was put to the second line to try and actually get it going, because Granlund and Duclair had at that point done absolutely nothing in that game, because I couldn't foresee any other reason for why Eklund would be dropped down, because he was one of the better Sharks players that night. And yet now I have learned that the reasoning is that he's been abandoning his defensive assignments, and so he just needed to be sort of toned down a bit and dropped down as a message being sent to him that, you have to be better. And so you can't get that first line, you get dropped down to the second line. And I can understand sort of the logic, but I have 2 issues with that. The first of which is when there is a player getting demoted, consequentially, a player needs to get promoted. You can't just leave an empty spot on the top line. And so the player who gets the benefit of that last game was Filip Zadina, who had done literally nothing, not only in that particular game, but recently, to deserve that promotion. But because Eklund is the player who is the man of the hour when it comes to David Quinn, who's watching him like a hawk in every single shift, Zadina, who has done nothing, put him on the first line. Who really cares? Because the player I'm focusing on is William Eklund. And it's not the end of the world that he's putting this type of emphasis on Eklund rounding out into a good player. Some would even say that that is a good thing, but it feels kind of bad, especially if you're looking at it from Eklund's perspective, that the players around you who really aren't playing as good as you are constantly getting rewarded because you are making the occasional mistake here or there. And the very same thing happened here tonight. Now, it is of course very true that when the Seattle Kraken had this 1-goal lead, Eklund makes a very clear mistake on a goal that would have seemingly made it 2-0 Seattle if not called back on the offside. And I cannot argue that this was a good defensive zone coverage from Eklund. I do think that there were slightly more excuses being able to be available. He's not able to skate backwards in this situation, so he has to kind of keep his eye on the puck holder as well as on his guy, with McCann behind him, trying to keep his head on a swivel, doesn't notice that McCann behind him is accelerating, so he's unable to keep up with him, yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, it is indeed a missed coverage from William Eklund. And so what is the punishment in this situation? Eklund does not just get sent down to the second line. Instead, he gets benched for a few minutes, only actually getting back on the ice by the time the first commercial break was over, meaning he missed probably a good 2 or even 3 shifts at that point. Now, Is it the end of the world that this type of accountability is sort of instituted into this team? No, but you would like to see some level of consistency to it. And this is exactly what I'm talking about just a minute later, when the very same line that Eklund was previously on, Hurdle and Zetterlund now being joined by Anthony Duclair, makes these very similar type of defensive mistakes. It is Duclair who gets caught flat-footed in the neutral zone and lets his man go right by him, and then later on it is Tomáš Hurdle who is just lackadaisically skating through the neutral zone into the defensive zone, making zero effort to catch up with his man Matty Beniers, who ends up with a glorious grade A opportunity to, at that point, I believe it was still 1-0 because of the called off goal, to make it 2-0 Seattle. And just because it didn't end up actually amounting to a goal doesn't mean that there were not mistakes made on this shift. And so was Duclair, or more specifically Tomáš Hurdle, penalized for 5-6 minutes and just rode the bench for that amount of time? Nope. They were immediately back on the ice. They did not miss a single shift in their usual rotation. And so that level of accountability, it seems as though Eklund is held to a significantly higher standard than everybody else. And I specifically call out Hurdle and Duclair because they were, at least Hurdle was Eklund's line mate, and it happened so soon after. But multiple players stood out in this terrible way. In fact, it wasn't so much the defense, like the defensive pairings, that were so terrible in this first period, giving up chance after chance. It felt as though a lot of the issues were actually with the forwards back checking. The Seattle Kraken were getting so many good rush chances, and while the defense for the Sharks definitely could have exercised much better gap control in these situations to give a lot less time and space for the Seattle Kraken player to work with, a lot of the time it was that third man back for the Sharks who just wasn't hustling to help out defensively, and that led to multiple goals against for the Sharks and chances against for the Sharks in that first period. And so the level of accountability is just nowhere to be found in this situation. And I also want to talk about the fact that Duclair gets promoted up to the first line in favor of Eklund. Duclair, ever since returning from his illness, has done literally nothing for the San Jose Sharks, and again, he is rewarded for doing literally nothing because another player is being penalized for things that are happening on the ice to basically everybody else who aren't getting penalized for it. So that's the first thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to William Eklund. The second thing is based on the roster that the Sharks iced tonight. So LeBanc steps out. I don't know if this is specifically injury related because he did take that really hard sort of slew foot type of hit from Nils Hoglander in the previous game against the Vancouver Canucks, or if this is a healthy scratch. It really could go either way for Kevin LeBanc, but there was an opening spot in the lineup. The Sharks, reminder, are already icing a defenseman as a forward here in Jacob McDonald, and while I have given praise to him at times in the past for being okay in the forward role, it still remains at the end of the day himself being a defenseman here. And so who do the Sharks put in to fill in that final forward spot? It is Nikolai Knizhov, which means technically the Sharks were not just running 7 defensemen and 11 forward, they were running 8 defensemen and 11 forward for what seems like the first time in NHL history. I don't know if that might be an exaggeration, but it doesn't. You very, very rarely see that type of setup, and yet here we are with the San Jose Sharks. Now, may I remind you that the Sharks came into tonight's game with the lowest goals for per game in the entire league, and it's not just by a couple percentage points. The Sharks came in with 1.5 goals against, or goals for per game. It has now dropped after the performance here tonight with just 1 goal tonight against Seattle, and the next closest team to them, Chicago, at 31st, has 2.53, meaning the Sharks are averaging more than 1 goal less than the next terrible offensive team in the league, meaning the Sharks are starved for offense even with the recent victory over the St. Louis Blues, which saw them score 5 goals. And so the solution to that David Quinn has come up with is icing an 8th defenseman in this game. And it'd be one thing if Knizhov, actually had some offensive talent to his game, but it's not really the case. Instead, he is pretty much just a sort of copy-paste of players like Burrows or Ruda, who are, decent enough defensively, bottom pairing guys maybe on an actual good team, but giving 0 offensive elements to this roster at this point. Meanwhile, toiling away in the AHL, players like Thomas Bordeleau, Danil Gushin, even offensive defensemen who could add an interesting element to the roster like Gavanke or Mukhamadullin, they're just sitting there in the minor minor leagues at this point, playing game after game with the Barracuda. And I know a lot of people talk about, well, do you really want them in the losing environment of the San Jose Sharks? The Sharks are so bad. Wouldn't you rather them having success with the Barracuda? The Barracuda were very bad last season. This season is, I believe, slightly better, but they're still very bad. Today, they were 26th in the league, and that, I believe, is out of 31 teams instead. So they're right there in the basement as well. This is not a team that is enjoying so much success where you're expecting an elite playoff run, competitive, try to win the Calder Cup in the AHL. This is a situation where both the Sharks and the Barracuda are both very bad teams, and while the Sharks are significantly worse, it is still a losing environment in both spots. The other argument also is, well, wouldn't you rather Gushin play an expanded role in the AHL compared to getting fourth line minutes in the NHL? Sure, if that was the sort of duality of the choices, if it was a binary choice of, well, he either gets 20 minutes a night in the AHL or 8 minutes a night in the NHL, but it's not as though there is any rule that says he should only be getting 8 minutes. We saw in his previous stint of couple of games, just a week ago at this point, that Gushin was given about 17 minutes in his first performance with the San Jose Sharks this season because he was actually looking quite good. That's something that you can do on a consistent basis. And the reason that he was originally sent down recently was, well, he's just not defensively responsible enough. This team gave up 20 goals over the span of 2 games, and tonight gave up 7 goals in one of the worst played first periods of the year, but I can't even say it's definitely the worst because they gave up 20 goals in 2 games just a few weeks ago. So I don't think Gushin bad defensively is really all that big of a deal when the entire team seems to be bad defensively. But it's not even Gushin that needs to necessarily be called up. Why not bring Bordeleau back up? He's already played a few games back in the earlier parts of this season and has done well in his short stint in the AHL at this point. I mentioned a couple of offensive defensemen. Why not try someone completely off the board and bring up someone like Ethan Cardwell, who's got 11 points thus far with the Barracuda, is right up there in terms of point totals with some of the other strong or at least more notable names. So he could be someone, maybe not to go in the top 6, but to give some effort, some energy, some excitement to the Sharks' bottom 6. There are options here that do not involve playing your 8th defenseman as a forward or sort of in the roster here tonight. It just doesn't really make much sense at all. And so there were multiple issues I felt outside and inside of this game that eventually lead to this 7-1 loss for the San Jose Sharks. And it's hard to see some light at the end of the tunnel, and it feels as though we are always going to eventually end up with games like this seemingly every once in a while at this point, just because of indeed these moves made by the powers that be, I guess you could say. And when it comes to the goaltenders here tonight, usually the saving grace, not really there. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday, where they will take on the Montreal Canadiens. It'll be an afternoon game, so maybe the Sharks will not be so sleepy for that one, and we'll see how they do. Class dismissed.